Hi, Writing 350. Today I want to talk about Chapter 9, which is negative messaging in your textbook. So we'll just kind of go through this briefly to go over the highlights of negative messages. So, purpose of doing them, we do these all the time in our regular life, right? So we need to give someone bad news. Essentially, that's what it means, right? So we want to give them the news and make sure that they understand it and accept it. Not just that they get it, but that they know the full weight of what is happening, and also that we're maintaining goodwill, right? Obviously, it's a little more challenging in a negative message because we're telling someone they don't want to hear, but we want to do it in the most respectful way possible, and also making sure that we're giving them all of the information that they need. So we want to think about how we organize negative messages, right? First, we want to consider who your audience is, and why does it matter, right? So we're going to communicate negative messages different to our peers, to our subordinates, to our superiors, to our customers, and depends on who they are and the way that we communicate that. So if you want a further breakdown of that, you can check out Figure 9.1 in your textbook to kind of help you understand the nuanced differences between those. And in your assignment for the week, we'll also want to make sure you're communicating correctly to the right way to the right audience. So you also have to consider, as we've said many times in the course already, the channel for the message, right? How are we going to tell them? So telling somebody bad news, we usually want to use a more personal channel. If you're getting fired, you probably don't want your boss to just text you a frowny face, right? That says you're fired or something. So we want to decide based on the severity of the message, if it's going to be a surprise, how complex it is, kind of the expectation of the corporate culture, and also considering the relationship that we have. So starting with the subject line, right? If you're including a subject line, whether you're writing a memo or an email, in positive messages, we talked about subject lines being more specific and just giving the good news away, right? To help the readability that people will want to read it right away. If we're using a negative subject line, you don't want to just list the problem in the subject line, right? We want to list something that is related to the topic, but isn't like the whole thing. If it's a low stakes issue, you can list the full problem, like, I need another copy of this, or, something simple. You can choose to include a buffer in a negative message or not. There's pros and cons to doing that. Essentially what a buffer is, it's kind of like an introduction before we give the bad news. So these are different types of buffers that you might see before we kind of give the bad news. So we might focus on some of the positive elements. We might give some facts. We might try to break down what led to it, thanking everybody, giving a general principle. So this was the sample that I have of bad news, and you can think about how each buffer would function with that message. They can be hard to write. They can go wrong. They can kind of make the reader surprised, right? You're going through, you're kind of reading this generic buffer, and then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, my price is going up. Why don't you just tell me that right away? It might waste their time. They might not get to the bad news. So it's a challenging thing to write. It does have its place, so you can kind of decide if that's something that you want to include in your negative message or not. You want to be sure to provide a reason. So when we're giving somebody bad news, we have to kind of back it up, right? So if I emailed you and I said, you're failing this class, you can just stop participating, and that was all I said, you would be surprised and you would want more information, right? So we have to kind of give a reason to help the person accept the message. So we don't want to say we can't do anything. We don't want to criticize policy or put the company or your organization in a negative light, but try to explain it in a way that's reasonable. Sometimes there's policies that we have to enforce in life, and I'm sure you've all dealt with this, that you don't agree with, right? But it kind of weakens the message to say, well, it's just the company policy. That's what we have to do, right? Give the specific reason that they can accept. Going forward, we want to try to be polite when we're refusing something. And making sure that we are kind of de-emphasizing the you. So when we talk about you attitude previously in the course, we don't want to use you as a big part of negative messaging because it can kind of come across as blaming. So you can kind of see the difference here between the direct and implied refusal. It's really the same information, but taking out that you kind of takes the sting out a little bit. However, you want to make sure that you are being clear. People who want something are going to kind of latch on to any possibility that's there. I'm sure anybody who's worked in customer service has experienced this, like the person might argue with you and try to kind of, get the situation to work in their favor, even when, you've already told them no. You also want to be sure to provide an alternative. So you need to think about something that you can give them instead, right? It's kind of suggesting that we care, we want their needs met. And it also kind of stops them from having from psychological reactance, which would mean that they're become angry when they feel like their freedom is limited and they have reaction. So again, I'll go back to that example where if you're working in customer service and you tell someone no and you just kind of shut them down, we've all seen people who kind of have a very negative reaction to that in different levels. And it's because they feel like they're not heard. They feel like their freedom is restricted. So that's a very common reaction. Of course, that's not really building goodwill. And you get the people who are like, I'm never going to come here again. And I'm telling everybody how terrible it is. And right, that's where that comes from, is that being shut down. So if you can give them some type of reasonable alternative, even if it's just another person to talk to, something that we can do to kind of forward the situation that will help. So think about, as you're creating your negative message, what alternative can you provide for your audience? You want to end the message positively, looking to the future, and avoiding insincerity, right? Because you are giving them bad news. You don't want to just imply like everything's fine and not, being phony or false or anything like that. Apologies are something that we come across a lot in our society, and you want to make sure that you're not overly using apologies in your business communication. Apologies can have legal implications. If you say you're sorry for something, it's essentially admitting fault. And maybe it is your fault, right? So you have to think about when that's appropriate versus not. So if you do need to apologize for something, you want to make sure that it's brief, that it's sincere, and that it happens fast, right? As soon as you have made a mistake and you realize the need to apologize, do it then. Do it once, just in the message. But if it's a small error, you don't necessarily have to apologize, right? So we tend to over apologize sometimes, but in a business communication, it can kind of go downhill. Your discussion board for the week is about apologies and kind of the effectiveness of some of the big ones we've seen, especially kind of in this Me Too era. And deciding whether or not they were needed, whether they're appropriate, whether they're sincere, kind of how do they hit their audience. So you get to choose the one that you want to analyze. So think about one, that is interesting to you. I have a couple examples here if you want to look at those in the slides of a few very big ones that happened over the last few years. And you can kind of judge for yourself the level of effectiveness. Tone and negative messages, we want to make sure that we are using positive emphasis and you attitude, but not when we are speaking directly about the problem, right? Making sure the timing is appropriate, that's happening fast enough, and avoiding using a form letter, right? That the person just feels like, they have no connection to it. If you can use their name, things like that, that's kind of where the you attitude component comes in. Your book then outlines different types of negative messages where you have slightly different rules, I guess, in those types. So this one would be about claims and complaints, if you want to create one of those, and then as well as rejections or refusals, right, as well. And then lastly, looking at social media negative messages, We see this sometimes where companies make a mistake and they list it over social media. If you want to focus your apology on a social media message that for your discussion board, that would be acceptable as well. So looking at more of like a famous or popular one would be fine. But understanding when is it appropriate and when is it not, right? So going back to those channels, is the message too severe? Is it timely? Is it a surprise, right? What makes it go well versus not, and what makes it go wrong? So in your deliverable 2 video, I talked about your negative message scenario, which is about the perfect donut no longer offering the free shift donuts or coffee. So this is the one that you will be writing this week. It is a memo. So making sure that you're offering those reasons, offering those alternatives, not apologizing unless you're at fault, right? And you do have an opportunity for extra credit as well. This is the checklist that I'll be using to kind of grade. So if you want to take a moment to look at that, this is also listed on your assignment sheet, I believe. So you can kind of make sure that you're including everything that I'm looking for. So if you have any questions, reach out, and that is negative messaging.